Hey, thank you guys for being here. We're speaking against this little talk that my boss is doing, which is passwordless, right? The journey to passwordless. So you guys are committed to zero trust if you're here, or you're a little bit slow to register for talks in time to get in. Either way, I'm glad you're here. We've done a little bit of display unit hacking up here, so we'll see how this goes. As I said, my name is Alex Weinert. I work on the identity protection team. I'm the group program manager. There's several folks on my team here, so if you have lots of questions later, it's a good group to talk to. And I wanted to talk with you today about zero trust. As I said, I appreciate you being here. I think it's useful in some ways to start by thinking about where we come from. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about how I came to Microsoft. And I keep wondering when the story is going to get me in deep water, but we'll see how it goes today. So I've been at Microsoft as of today. Today is my 23rd anniversary at Microsoft. So I've been in it for a long, long time. So if you go back, way back to, and I'm now actually starting to hire people that actually weren't born yet when I started at Microsoft, which is a very strange feeling. If you go way back to that time, I came to Microsoft and I was given a badge, and I came into a building, and in that building was an office that was assigned to me, and under the desk in that office was a desktop PC. And that thing was plugged in to the network in the building, and it could get you to any other building, basically, that Microsoft owned, right? That was kind of where it would get you. And then we had mail. That was sort of the exception, right? And, or so they thought. The thing that was interesting about that was that I was hired as the fourth person on Microsoft's internet team. So I still have the shirt that says Microsoft Internet. And so there were a couple of us that had to be able to get out onto that crazy researchy thing that was the internet back then. And so we had to disconnect from your plug, and then you would dial in using a modem into what we were building, which was MSN. So we were building MSN at the time. And then you could get onto that wacky internet thing. And in that world, it was pretty reasonable that I could, from my desk in Building 25 at Microsoft, I could go to pretty much any source share, right? I could, go to other resources around the company, get to document shares, whatever, because, I work for the company. I'm in the building. I'm on a machine that was issued by the company. There's a sort of a nice, sense of I've got this walled garden and I'm pretty safe. And the thing that happened within a few months of my starting was that we had our company meeting, and it was Microsoft's 20th anniversary. And the company at the time was about 16,000 people, so it was small enough that we could all go into whatever was the predecessor, Kingdom, right? And before we blew it up. And we did the company meeting, and then Bill actually did a Q&A at the end of it. So people lined up on microphones like this, and Bill sitting on a stool on stage and taking questions. And this guy comes up to the microphone and he says, hey, I've heard about this telecommuting, telework thing. How do you feel about us, starting to take advantage of that? And instead of having to come to work all the time, we can dial in on the modem. And Bill said, and I don't think he was kidding at all. I think it was completely straight-faced. He said, listen, collaboration and in-person interaction is important. So I would like you for the first 40 hours of the week to be in the office, but the second 40 are up to you. And so began within a few months of my starting at Microsoft's, sort of adoption, explicit adoption of people being able to dial in and get on the corporate network. And that was VPN, right? But it was dial-in VPN. And now, of course, we have a different shape of that thing. But here's the part that, I always say get me in trouble. I didn't actually come to Microsoft through a normal route. I was doing a research project and needed to figure out how to do a protocol simulation, so I wondered if I could get to NT source code, and did, right? And then from there, I found Microsoft's web server of the day, which is like the Death Star. It was like a black circle with little cyan font on it. And on that thing was an FTP site, which was hooked up to the resume site. And so I dropped a resume directly in. And that's how I got hired at Microsoft, right? And so we thought that the walled garden, right, before they hired me, they thought the walled garden was good, but it wasn't. And then they added VPN. It didn't get any better. Right? And so the thing about it is that at some level, the model that we had back then was very restricted, but it still wasn't very safe. And what it allowed you to do was to deceive yourself, right? That everything was, cool because, hey, once you're on the network, it's fine. And I've had a lot of customers that have the same thing, which, oh no, it's fine, they're on the VPN, right? And those conversations are usually after the customer's been hacked, and we're trying to explain to them that the VPN is also tidily hosting the bad guys, right? My friend Yanon and I are going to be doing a talk tomorrow morning, and he'll go into some depth about what happens once they penetrate the VPN and how they stay resident and how the bad guys get permanency in that network. So we kind of fast forward a couple of decades. Man, I'm feeling old today. It's a completely different environment, right? Like everything's connected to everything. And I'm, got my Apple Watch and my phone, which I'll do a demo on later, my laptop, and I'm looking out at, like, so far so good. Not a lot of phones open yet, but it'll happen, right? So we can all be on the networks that are not our networks. We can all be on devices that are our devices, going to applications in the cloud, and it's pretty cool. There was a study that Forbes did, I don't have the quote here, but it's like a 100% increase in job satisfaction and a 23% increase in productivity because of this model, right? This mobile, sort of modern mobility environment where people can do work in the way that makes sense to them, right? And that's great. The thing to think about here is that you got a lot of devices, you got a lot of networks, you've got a lot of apps that you're going to, both on-prem and in the cloud. And so it's kind of hard to get your hands around how do I control this graph of stuff. The one thing that you do have some control over is the idea of what's the identity of that user. And so there's only one of the user, as Joy put it in her keynote. And so, this is where we kind of come, if you've been with us for a while, just by show of hands, who's on Azure Active Directory now? Okay, oh, that's awesome. That makes me so happy. So we've been on this journey for a while, and we've been saying things like assume breach, right? Identity is the control plane, and this is basically why. You need a way to get some policy sanity into your environment. And this essentially explains why it's identity, right? It's not that one network or that one app. So that's kind of the first thing we have to get in our heads is that identity is what we want to pivot around. And the second thing, and I think the most easy way to explain zero trust is that we go from the model that Microsoft had when I started all those years ago of assuming that things were hunky-dory because we're on that particular device, right, or in the building, to going to a place where we make no assumptions, right? We want to be in a place where we say, instead of inferred trust in an artifact, we're going to, and assumptions that things are safer somehow if they're on a particular network. We treat it like it really is, which is that all of your resources are accessible by the open internet. And let me assure you, all of your resources are accessible on the open internet, right? Like from a physical perspective, there are port scans and there are port vulnerabilities and other issues. And so you want to go to this model where you say, okay, what if I just make this assumption that everything's in the cloud? And I want to model as though everything's in the cloud, right? And then I go to this, the sort of the source of zero trust, which is, okay, verify everything. Verify and re-verify and actually model your policies so you're being super explicit about what you want to do. So do you assume that, well, that person must have had MFA and they must have had a cert on their device and they must have been in the building, whatever, because they're on the network. But the way they got on that network is they stole a device out of somebody's backpack that had a cert on it and got in that way, or they found a loophole either because of an exploit against the VPN or unfortunate story that we can talk about, which is a customer who had an angry executive traveling, and their device did not have the cert and could not get the cert from where they were. And so the IT department opened up a port, like essentially a hole in the VPN, saying, well, if you're in this region and you're on this kind of device, then you can go ahead and get into the VPN with just a password. And so it took a while, but a year later, that exception that was made for that one business trip was still in place. Nobody had removed it. And the bad guys found their way in and got residency in the network, right? So again, we want to get to a place where we think, all right, let's just check on everything. So with those kind of principles in mind, right, with this sort of model in mind, we can go on and say, all right, let's get started. And we're near Kennedy, so it's hard not to make rocket references. Let's go ahead and get started on the journey and shift from this sort of hypothetical background model to a little bit more concrete, and we'll keep stepping forward on this. So when we talk about this journey with customers, the way that I like to think about it is that we're all IT professionals, right? And so your crown jewels are data. There's some form of data. Now, there might be exceptions where you'd say, well, it's an API that's controlling a robot. But even that's really a data stream, right? So the question is, how do you secure the data? And we want to make sure that we're secure in 3 ways. We want to be secure at the point of access, right? At the point that we grant access to that data. We want to make sure that we're secure on the device, and we verify the device. And we want to make sure that we're secure in transit as that data flows, right? And so sort of those are the 3 pivots. And then in terms of what we can verify, there's a ton of stuff we can verify around that access. So when a user is going to a resource, right, there's a bunch of things that we know, and that gets down to who they are, what roles they're in, what their normal behavior patterns are, what their expected application usage is based on who they are in the company. There's a ton of information there, and we can kind of go around the circle and talk about, okay, what about the application? Can it look at things like, wow, a lot of people are suddenly getting the exact same mail? What about the devices? Can we look at, is the device pin locked? Is it encrypted? Is it secure? So all these things are things that we can go verify and be explicit about. And then importantly, we have something else we can throw at this, which is, I've alluded to, which is the intelligence we have. What about the fact that the IP that you're coming in on is an IP that you've never been seen on before, and that is having an extremely high rate of failed logins right now? Right, so we can look at the environment we're in and actually make some decisions based on that. And so we want to pull all of that information together for this continuous verification process to the extent we can. Unsurprisingly, if you're an Azure AD person, right, the way that we look at this is the toolkit for this, sort of the policy decision point for Zero Trust is around conditional access. So today, on a sort of a daily active user basis, we have about 27 million users under protection by conditional access. So we have good adoption, and it's growing fast. And the thing that's great about that for people who are starting out on their Zero Trust journey is that there's a lot of folks who've come before you, right? Each of those users belongs to some organization that's already some way down the path. And we are fortunate that we hear back and we get feedback on what we can do better, right? And so this is kind of a continuous investment that we're doing to make this platform stronger. But conditional access is where the bet is. And it is really built around this idea that we're moving to a world of mobility, mobile devices, networks that are, say, in conference centers, and applications that are hosted in the cloud on infrastructure you didn't buy or deploy, and that you didn't write the code for, right? So how do we think about getting controlled in that environment? And conditional access is this sort of secure at the point of access starting point. All right, so now we have a very long build slide. This is how you know that designers have helped with the slides. My slides are all like, not pretty. This is good. All right, but I am gonna click right through it because it drives me crazy to build. All right, so this is conditional access, right? Conditional access, how many people are using conditional access actively right now? That is awesome. So like a good 50% of the room, that's cool. All right. Okay, so then hopefully not too much you don't already know, but conditions and controls are sort of the heart of conditional access, right? The conditions you can think of, and a lot of the people who either designed or built that product are in the room right now. So again, good time for questions. The conditional access, you can think of it as the conditions are a selector. It's a policy selector, right? So we just are watching. We essentially run a rule on every login, and we say, all right, let's look at all the things that we can detect about this login. But what you can detect is a pretty long list, right? So you can detect the kind of user it is. Is it a partner, B2C, B2E? Are you coming in from a particular network or not? Are you coming in on a particular type of device from a particular type of app? There's a bunch of observables there, right? The physical location is part of it. Is the device carrying a cert that says it's managed? There's a ton of information that we can pick up and glean. The other thing that we can pick up, if you think about intersecting three things, right? The first is, what are the observables of the login? The second is, what's the history of that user for login, right? What have they done before? So that's the second piece of information we can start to intersect. So is that IP an IP you've been on before? Is that device a device you've been on before? Is this a time of day you normally go to the service? All that kind of information filters in, and then that will become part of what we call session risk, right? The third thing that we can filter in is the environment. And so the environment tells us things like, hey, is this device currently on a botnet? Do we happen to know that it's infected right now? Because of the work that we do with DCU to do botnet detection. is this IP address one that's currently involved in an active attack against our system. Right, so there's a bunch of other information that we can then roll in. We can start looking at the environment. So now we have the user, the login activity, the history of that user, and then we can add into that the environment that we're operating in. And all that together becomes things that you can say, okay, if these things happen, I want to fire a policy. I want this policy to apply. On the other side of this, okay, are any standards geeks? OIDC, right? So like the OIDC, essentially doing claims with that is kind of the mental model you should have for what a control is. A control is just a place that we send, conceptually, we send a client to go get a claim to get more information to us so we can finish the login activity, right? So if you thought about this thing as a flow, what would happen is you attempt to log in, we look at the way that you're logging in, we look at the claims you're carrying, we decide if we need more, and if we do, we send you away for more. So a classic example on this is multi-factor auth, right? You signed in, but the way that you're signing in, we want to see multi-factor auth, so we send you away. Some parts of the system were built either before or in a much, because we have a lot of infrastructure that don't fully follow this model. But when you look at things like the TOU control, it's literally just an OIDC claim. You can actually model it exactly that way. The integrations we've done with third-party multi-factor auth providers like Duo and RSA are also following that model, right? So on the one hand, conditions. On the other hand, claims, right? And that's really all there is to it, but it gives us a ton of power. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what we can do here. So in addition to things like just saying, no, you can't get in, or yes, you can get in, but you got to do more, right? We can also do, and then the got to do more can be lots of different things. We can also do something fairly cool, which is we can decorate the ticket that we're issuing with instructions to the relying party, right? And so the best example of this, and I'll show it to you a little bit later, is with SharePoint right now. We can actually send them an instruction that says, hey, given the nuances of this session, the admin has asked that you don't allow download, right? And so we'll show that in a minute. That is kind of the next thing that we can do with conditional access, right? We can get into actually expressing not just whether you should issue a ticket, but what are the conditions of the issuance of that ticket. And that's something we'll be expanding on an ongoing basis. Right now we're doing it with SharePoint, and we've just added Outlook web access as well. So you can actually get restricted, you can prevent data from flowing onto a device that you haven't managed or in a situation you don't like. So this is sort of the heart and soul for us of the control surface. And when you go into looking at the rest of the puzzle, like we say, okay, now how do I make sure the device that I'm flowing the data to is secure? Then that really, at the end of the day, ends up being a claim that we're verifying, right? A cert that we get from the device to verify at the point of access in conditional access, right? And so what about the Azure Information Protection or Microsoft Information Protection? If I want to make sure that you're okay to open this document, I look at what? Who you are. So it goes back to the identity. And then we can also do things like say, there's a conditional access rule for opening that document, right? So you might say, it's fine that you logged into SharePoint and downloaded the encrypted document. When you go to open it, you're going to have to do MFA or be on a compliant device. So there's a ton of power in this, and we'll walk through kind of, again, some of the things to think about. So as we go to implement this, I'll take you through a few things to think about, and then you'll have earned the demo, or my attempt at the demo. The first thing to talk about here is when we look at how to implement zero trust, if you are in a world where you have a bunch of sort of a tapestry of policy engines, a tapestry of IDPs, a tapestry of repositories of data for identity, it becomes very, very hard to reason over the policy, right? Because you're trying to stitch things together all the time. It's the old joke that a man with one clock knows what time it is, but a man with two is never sure, right? Because you've got too many different sources of truth. So one thing that we'd encourage you to do is, if you're using Azure AD already, you're using conditional access already, do what you can to consolidate the users into that control space so that you have a single point of audit, single point of policy, single point of control. And then as you will hear over and over, and it's not an accident at this conference, please use multi-factor auth, right? Passwords alone do not secure things. Lots of people in the room can give you lots and lots of reasons why. We deal with, quite literally tens of thousands of password or more of password compromises every day in our system. That means places where the bad guy actually got in. We prevent tens of millions more. And so, password by itself is not enough. Password, MFA is something that's just in the system. There's nothing additional to buy. Please use the multi-factor auth to secure your credentials and your logins. Single sign-on. If an app is not authenticating against the system, then there's no way to apply the controls, right? So if you have an app that's, well, gee, it's okay, it's on-prem. Gee, it's okay, it's using, username, password, and forms basic. There's a million horror stories there. You don't have any control of that. And again, the idea that, well, the only way somebody's gonna get to that is they're in the building was false even in 1995. Next thing is to think, okay, assume breach. If we're gonna move forward in this model, we wanna say, always work in a least access mode. So try to minimize the access that you have. So things like privileged identity management, and access reviews and audits are all ways that you can try to reduce that exposure. And then monitoring behavior on premises. So if you do have an on-premises network, here's the thing where so far I've been saying stuff and you're thinking, but I have there's a real world out there, like this fantasy world where I don't have to worry about my on-premises apps, right? No, there's a ton of stuff out there that's legacy and it's gonna be around for a while. And any time you do a kind of an architectural transition like this, it's a huge, long journey, right? So while you're on that journey, protect yourself as much as you can. And one of the ways to do that is, do think about again, if we assume breach, we assume that the VPN is not the wall we thought it was, right? Then you have to be monitoring for breaches on premises, right? And so, again, we'll be talking some more about that tomorrow. But HTTP is our tool for that, for monitoring traffic around the domain controllers and looking for things like pass the ticket attacks and such. So do, stay vigilant on premises as you're going through the journey. All right, so the devices, right? The big thing here is, do I know that this is a device that I would feel good about user data being on? So I used to be a development manager, and I had, this is when we were building MSN, product called Communities, which if anybody's used, then bless you. So it was sort of an early version of our attempt at something Facebook-ish, right? And we did a ton of storage in the cloud, and well, what seemed like a ton at the time. Worked on a project called Terra Server, which was to prove that you could store a terabyte of data on a SQL array. And so that gives you, again, a sense of how long ago it was. But in that environment, we had kind of moved on to where there was more VPN and more folks using laptops. And I had a developer on my team who was working on essentially some identity code for that system. And she had a full snapshot, essentially, of our whole subset of MSN on her laptop, right? I live in a part of Seattle called Ballard, which used to be not as cool as it is now, but it's pretty cool now. She went into Ballard, and there was a bar there, and she parked her car outside the bar. And when she came back outside, her rear window had been smashed in, and they'd taken her bag, right? She left her bag in plain sight on the rear seat. And they had her laptop, which means they had all of our source code, right? Now, the good news is probably the person that's smashing out windows in Ballard doesn't really care about the source code. They're going to go just pawn the laptop. But the better news was that we had just rolled out BitLocker, and that code was safe, right? We didn't have to worry about anything other than the physical asset, right? So that world where it's not that it's a bad person or a bad user, it's that things happen. You forget your laptop in a cab or your phone in a cab or whatever. How do you, as an organization, make sure that that device has got, retains some control? So pin locking, encryption, remote wipe. Can we make sure there's another kind of theft, which is malware, right? Malware on the device can transmit data. So how do we make sure that the operating system version is current, or that you're on a current malware detection signature, right? And all that stuff comes into the role of the MDM, and then integrating that into the story. So how do I verify the device on the other side, right? So making sure the devices are known, healthy, and compliant, and then also making sure that they are staying that way, right? So we want to have some way to say, look, if the device gets infected, if it shows up on that botnet, or if it gets a malware detection on it, that we can actually revoke access from it, right? And so that's where, if you're familiar with our stack, that's going to be, Windows Defender ATP can actually send signal to us that says, look, revoke access for this machine, right? And then maybe you go from there to say, and go ahead and remote wipe it as well, right? But again, ensuring that we're thinking about both verifying and controlling the aspects of that device. Oh, something magical happened. Look at that. All right. So, so the next thing is the apps. And there's a couple of things to think about here. Okay, animations are cool. I said what I thought about animations earlier, right? I'm not a huge animations fan. So when we look at the applications, right, we can look at, first of all, thinking about what happens if data is transmitted down to the application. Can I, force it to flush its cache? Can I make sure the application is configured in a way I like? Where this becomes pretty popular is that if you have users that are super resistant to the idea that their device is managed by an MDM, sometimes they will accept that an app can be managed. And then in more extreme cases, the other side of it is if you want to be super secure, you actually manage both the device and the app, right? But mobile application management is a good tool for making sure that data is flowing to the right kind of apps. Another thing that we should talk about that we just rolled out is something called blocking legacy authentication, right? So if you think about the number of applications that are out there in the wild that use, POP, sort of sessionless protocols, they can't do MFA challenges, I think it's reasonably safe to say people need to move on. There's a huge number of attacks that source out of those legacy protocols, so start thinking about what are the kinds of apps at a class that you're willing to accept. Would you really want to say, hey, I'm not rolling out MFA to my users because they might want to use a 10-year-old POP client, right? We want to try to get people moved on. And again, this is very nuanced, and every org will have different user bases and different tolerances, but as you go through this, thinking about how to restrict that is a big deal. For people who have turned on the policy to block legacy authentication in their environments, we see a 66% reduction in account compromise. So it's quite remarkable, right? Quite drastic. So again, thinking about verifying and controlling what's going on there. You can use things like cloud app security to discover what apps are in use in the organization to bring those under management. That's useful in terms of, again, trying to get that one point of policy and control. And then managing application sessions. This is the thing where a cloud app security broker like Microsoft Cloud App Security can essentially look at what's going on the pipe, right? So this is where we lose visibility. If people are familiar with Kerberos or the Kerb model for the way the tickets work, essentially once the IDP has issued a ticket to the client and the relying party or the app are having a conversation that does not involve any centralized authority, right? It's strictly between the client and the application. So in secure environments or for high security data, it makes sense to do something like use a reverse proxy where you're actually essentially doing a man in the middle on your own users. But what that allows you to do is to look for things like, oh look, here goes credit card data, or here goes user PII, or here goes the super secret documents in a way we don't want them to go. So this is a good tool for the cases where you need to actually know what's happening in the session, right? So these are all things that you can verify inside the framework. Okay, and then finally, here's my good user, connected well, got to a nice secure device, fat fingered the email address and sent the document to the wrong person. It gets back to identity, right? Can we make sure that that document is secure? So thinking about things like, sensitivity of sites, classification of data, auto classification. When we look at, making sure that documents are encrypted in transit, it's a thing to be thoughtful of. At the end of the day, if you do everything right, but then your team decides to share stuff on a Dropbox site with a password like password, right, you haven't done enough. And so the document management stuff is helpful. It also gives you some more signals. So we can do things like if a document pops open in a very strange location, that can be signaled back to us that we need to terminate both the document and look at the user as being at risk. Right, so that's again, kind of the web of detections that you're doing. And again, everything's out in the open, right? If you just assume that there is no walled garden, so everything you're doing, you do it as though, it's out in the wild, then these are some of the tools you can work with. I'm gonna show you, I hope, a quick demo. This is always the fun part, right? Like, will the demo work? All right, so I'm just gonna go into the portal real quick. And for those of you who are already using conditional access or familiar with it, I'll try to show you a few new things that we're working on right now. All right, so step one, just taking a look in the portal. So hopefully most folks are familiar, or most of you who are using AAD and conditional access are familiar with this. I'm just going to show you a couple of policies to give some examples of the kinds of things we're talking about. Okay, so one of the things I want to show you here is just the basics, right? Let's say I want to say that I want to challenge users who are going to SharePoint with multi-factor auth, right? I just want to get you into the model real quick. So I'm going to do a quick primer for those who aren't familiar with CA yet. So basically when we talked about the conditions and controls, right? Conditions are the selectors. So everything that's here as a selector is under this thing that says assignments, right? Very commonly people want to do one of two kinds of rollouts. One kind of rollout is I want to start with my team and then expand and expand and expand. And the other one is I want to start with just the one app and make sure it works and then expand and expand and expand, right? The second one is really useful when we get into things like what clients are people using, what are the mobile apps that are preferred, and how do we make sure that we can control it? And we want to control the impact to help desk, right? We want to control the impact to our reputations and make sure nobody keys our car or whatever, right? Because it can be a bad thing to create too much user friction. So we're doing a lot of work to try to make that easier. In the model here, we have promoted two things up out of the conditions, and those are the rollout things, which are users and apps. And in both cases, what you can do is you can say, look, I want it to apply to everything. I want to apply it to a specific one. I can select it by groups, and then I said I would show you some new things. Something that's new in preview here is that you can now select on roles, right? So we can get into thinking about, for our most privileged accounts, what are the policies we're setting up for those. In Azure Active Directory, generally speaking, we're making a huge bet on RBAC, right? We're trying to really extend the role stuff that we're doing. So conditional access, yay, we can now select conditional access policies based on role. All right. I'm going to just bail out of this one. Okay, so for cloud apps, the same thing. So remember my hopefully gentle nag to get all your apps authenticating through Azure Active Directory. It's important to note that this is not limited to just cloud apps, like on-prem apps as well. Right? You want to really think about getting all of your estate. There's no difference, right, between the stuff you host in the cloud and the stuff those other guys host in the cloud, right, because it's all in the cloud. So in this world, we would look at which apps we want to do. And I can select any app that's been configured for single sign-on, whether it's on-premises or in the cloud, right? So in this demo tenant, we've got a bunch of different apps. There's like 3,500, but I think it's less. It's like 3,000 apps now that are essentially one-click configuration for Azure AD. So most of the apps that people commonly use are there, and you can also roll in custom apps and that sort of thing. So that's fairly straightforward to do. Okay, then we get into the other conditions, and this is where we can have a little more fun. So the other conditions can include things like, what's the risk, what's the anomaly on this session, right? Like, so our algorithms in this case are evaluating things in real time, and Rajat back there is leading that charge for us, right? So Rajat's the PM on the signal stuff, and Maria is one of the data scientists that drives the actual intelligence behind it. And that allows us to allow you to say, look, I've got all these compliance policies and all the ways that I thought bad guys might get in. It's really good to have a risk policy as well, because once they've navigated all the rules that you put in place, you still have anomalies, right? And the anomaly detection here is what you're seeing with the sign-in and risk detection. So you can set up policies for that to either block or challenge on that. Device platforms, you can get into which specific kind of device. Again, really useful for doing rollouts. So let's make sure all the iOS devices work. Now let's make sure all the Android devices, so you don't get hit all at once with support for all of those things. You can pre-configure locations so you know that somebody's in your building versus somebody else's, although I wouldn't put too much weight on just that. You want to verify other things as well. And then the client apps thing is what I was showing before, we just talked about. And the way it shows up is for blocking legacy auth. Oh, please network. Okay, is just, we can go through and we can say, which apps do we want to use, and then, I'm sorry, let's see. I might have the wrong demo going here. Couple apps, nope. All right, I'll skip over that one. And then device state here, we can look in terms of are we managed or not. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in terms of conditions. All those things come up, and then to select whether the policy should fire, and then we move on to the controls. The controls in this case we're selecting is just, should I do multi-factor auth or not? Right, so this is, we're gonna allow access, but with multi-factor authentication. And so these are the different kind of claims you can grab. You can also do TOU here. You can require that you're on a domain joined device. You know, there's other things you can work into that. All right, and then the session stuff I was talking about before. So the app enforced restrictions, and then we can also route things through MCAS in selected environments. So a good example here is I've got a high-risk asset, and I've got a user who's showing session anomaly. I might do an MFA challenge, but then audit and track the session using the Cloud App Security Broker, right? So that I can actually see what happened inside the session. So you can be selective about when you use it and which policy you use. Dana from my team is doing a presentation on how MCAS and Active Directory are integrating, and there's some really cool scenarios in there that you can go check out in his talk. All right, so briefly through a few other policies that we have set up. So we have MFA for SharePoint, and then we're also going to say that we want to limit SharePoint access based on the label, like how confidential things are. And so I'll show you that working in a second. So let's go ahead and just see how it works. Okay, so here I am, I've signed in, right? You saw me sign into the portal. I didn't get an MFA challenge. Now I'm signing into Office, still not getting an MFA challenge. I can go into, you know, for example, my email, and everything's fine. I'm kind of dialing where I want the friction, and you know, where I want the control here using conditional access. If I then go back and I think about, all right, let's hit SharePoint. If things go well, now let me just warm up for a second. If things go well, they should, we'll get a multi-factor auth challenge. But where it gets trickier is that I bought this watch just so I could do this demo. Because we have this cool thing, right, which is the authenticator is now on the watch. So it's very like, very Dick Tracy kind of. I think Alex Simons tried this demo with Melanie earlier today. And my understanding is it didn't work. But it's been working for me, so I don't know. All right, so this interstitial that's popping is actually being driven by us in an OAuth flow, right? And we're saying, look, in this case, we need to approve it, and ta-da. All right, let's see what happens. I've also got somebody at my door, apparently. I got a ring notification at the same time. All right, cool, yes. All right. That's so cool. That's like almost worth buying an Apple Watch for. And it worked. I'm glad to give you a demo that you didn't get earlier on today. Who was in that presentation, Alex's presentation? That's it? Wow. All right, you guys are, it was, I guess, 85 slides in 75 minutes, right? It was just a whirlwind. It was just a blitz. All right, so here we are. We're in SharePoint. Everything's great. If I were to go in and look at like the fun team stuff site, this is a new feature, and it's a lot of demand for this from our customers, which is, you know, not every SharePoint site is the same, right? So it'd be nice if we could think about how is that site classified. So our friends in SharePoint have done a bunch of great work here, and this will continue to extend and be richer and richer in terms of the controls you can put on it. But this one says it's a group that's classified as general. So let's see if I can make this work without ruining everything. Hey, look at that. All right, so see how it says general right there? And you can do whatever you want. Like you can go and open the documents and do whatever you want in that environment. If you were to go back and look at the financial site, however, the big scary stuff you don't want to get out, right? Then this one gets the yellow bar of doom. Okay, so the yellow bar at the top says, let's try some more of this pinch and drag stuff, right? Your organization will not allow you to download, print, or sync on this particular device. And so the rule that we set up said that on a device that we don't have control to remote wipe, that isn't pin locked, that isn't compliant with our policies, we're not going to let you actually flow the data to the device, right? So that's the rule set in this particular environment. And so that's an example of where we're actually using the data classification as a new aspect of what we can do with conditional access. So it's another point where you have more control. All right. Let's resume. okay, let's review what we've talked about so far. Right, remember that? Okay, and we did this. And we talked about that. And this, and this, and this, and this. All right, good. Wait, no, we went too far. Oh, no. Okay, here we go. Okay, when we were last in the slide deck, we were in this demo slide. All right, moving ahead. This is the theme of Ignite this year, is slide advancement problems. So if you've seen frustrated presenters like doing this, it's because we've had some issues with the remotes. I cannot blame what just happened on that, though. That was all me. So the next thing I want to talk about, just as we look at the environment that we're in, okay, is, and the last few minutes here, is we do have, as we talked about before, environmental data, anomaly data, and the intelligence that the system brings to bear is an advantage for you, right? You can implement a lot of what we talked about using any number of solutions, but one place where we have unique advantage is leveraging intelligence. So things like automatically changing compromised credentials, challenging on session risk, some of the stuff I've already shown you, denying access to infected devices, the revocation of documents that I talked about is all part of that. And where we're really, I think, differentiated is that it turns out we have a few Windows devices out there. We have a few, people out there working on the botnet investigations. Our team alone, on the identity protection side, on our team, we are evaluating 18 billion logins a day, right? Doing something like 40 terabytes of data through our machine learning systems a day, right? So it's a real volume of data that's hard to replicate. And when you kind of stitch it all together, and you get into this, the concept of the intelligence security graph, bringing all those things together for you to help you really understand, where the threats are and what you should and shouldn't allow. So when we think about that zero trust environment, deciding whether to trust, another easy way to think about this is it's about triangulation. Like, how many points of data can you triangulate to confirm that the thing that you're seeing is what you want to see? And one of the places we can really help you out there is around the amount of signal that we have in the intelligence security graph. If we look at kind of how this can work in the real world, this is a fairly cool case study. We do a bunch of stuff on the identity side that's similar to this, where we can see an attack starting to get going and then dynamically shut down the IPs. This is something we do all day, every day, is like shutting down IP addresses because they're on the attack, right? And using very similar stuff. But this is a cool example of how this happened in a different environment, which is that we had something called cloud-based detonation, which is the detonation chamber that essentially we can take a phishing payload, like a document that's been going out in fish mail, and detonate them to see what they do. And it identified a new attack called Bad Rabbit 14 minutes after the first encounter with the mail, right? Shut down that attack in 14 minutes. There were, the algorithm picked up Emotet, right, in real time and shut it down. So there's some really cool examples here of how, the ML stuff that we're doing, cloud intelligence, and this sort of large amount of data sharing within Microsoft can really help protect users. And so the intelligence here is a key part, I think, of what makes this story sing as you get into it. So I want to talk a little bit about some more intelligence, then I'll wrap up as I'm going tight on time. Different kind of intelligence. This is the intelligence in the room. The team, my team includes a group of people who are our investigations and response team. And they, the guys that when they open the door and they say, I need to talk to you, it's never really a good day. But so often, the question I always ask is, did we detect it? Did we detect it? Did we detect it? And the answer is almost always yes, right? So we got to a place where we've got to find a way to get people to use what we've already offered them, because that would stop most of the attacks, by a vast majority, most of the attacks. And so we put together some guidance. Nitika led this, she's right there, to put together some guidance. And this shows up in 3 different ways. One way is what I'm about to tell you about is this paper. So, the idea of there's some basic steps you can take. Like using MFA will block 99.99% of attacks. When Maria figured that number out, I was like, no, that's too easy a number, but it's actually the number. Reducing your attack surface, I mentioned blocking legacy auth reduces 66% of compromise and the tenants that have done it. Automated threat response, people who do automatic MFA to challenge risky logins, block 96% of compromise. And these are all real numbers from our user base, right, that we're just studying the risk signals. we still have a lot of time that people stay resident in networks once they get resident. That number is down to 101 from 140, so it's getting better, which is one of the few things that is in our industry. But that detection is a place where if we can get people to pay attention to signals, it's kind of a big deal. So we're sending you alerts, we're giving you reports, please look at them. And then finally, if you use self-help, I think of self-help not as a cost reduction thing, although it works that way. It's not about user satisfaction, although it works that way. But what self-help does is it forces you to automate the processes and gets the crying and screaming effect out of the equation, right? Like you can't call the machine and scream about how you want your password back. You actually have to follow the steps. We had our tier 1 help desk guys were responsible for 60% of the account compromise we had in Xbox when I started doing this particular type of work for Xbox about 10 years ago. And we actually shut down tier 1. We just shut it all down. We said, we have it, but it only is a tour guide. It's like, well, there's UI over there. Why don't you try that? There's no more access to the accounts because the emotional appeal thing was too prevalent. So watch out for help desk as far as the emotional appeal. All of this is gathered up in a document called security steps. So you can go to that document, aka.ms/security steps, and it kind of walks you through step by step what to do in your environment. I'm not going to demo this because I'm out of time, but what I will tell you is the stuff that actually lots of other folks have shown around, that document is codified in 2 other ways. One is called baseline protection, and baseline protection is work that is essentially trying to make it so it's one-click easy to go through and set up, like here's the best guidance. So for example, protecting your admins with MFA is something you can go through and say in one click, all right, we'll do that thing. It shows up in conditional access as policies there. So you go to conditional access, there's a pre-canned policy called baseline protection for admins. We have another one that's coming soon, will be baseline protection for users, and essentially sets core policies that we recommend and that'll automatically work in what we believe is the best practice. This is based on the data we have. And then the last thing, the document, the baseline protection policies, and then Secure Score, which you've been hearing about hopefully all through the conference. And Secure Score is where we're taking that same exact guidance that we codified in the document, codified in the policies, and then giving it to you in a sort of a gamified, easy to understand way to do it. So the flow is go look at your Secure Score, pick the top item off the list, which is actually protecting your admins with MFA. Nitika gave the stats earlier. I won't even repeat it. It's so depressing. But whatever number you're thinking in your head in terms of the admins, right, in our system that are using MFA, it's lower than the number you have in your head. Unless you were at our TAC last year, in which case you know how bad it is. But it's super, super bad. So that's an easy thing to do. Go to Secure Score, top item on the list, baseline for admins, turn it on. Make sure you're doing MFA for your admins. Good luck on your zero trust journey. Thank you guys very much for your time and for the wild ride. All right.